Hey guys, tonight we begin with the haunting love story of a mortal and a goddess, set not in the sky, but in a orchard high above the world, where time itself once faltered. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Far above the reach of cities, temples, and gods, nestled on a quiet ledge in the ancient Pendis Mountains, there lived a healer named Andronikos. His home was an orchard, more than a house. Fig trees, wild pears, and silver. Leafed olives stretched in all directions, their roots tangled with thyme and lavender. A simple hut stood at the centre, half swallowed by vines and soft moss. Andronikos lived alone, but not in loneliness. He spoke to plants the way other men might speak to priests. His fingers knew the weight of dew, the secrets of bark, the sigh of aching roots. Pilgrims sometimes found their way up the winding goat trails, bent with illness or heartbreak, and he'd offer them a tincture or balm. He never asked for coin, just silence, a quiet exchange between soul and soil. It was said that no god had stepped foot on that mountain in centuries, whether from sacred distance or forgotten disdain. The divine had left the high grove untouched. No shrines, no relics, no offerings. The land was pure in a way the rest of the world had long forgotten. And that's why Andronikos stayed. He was not a man of temples. He had no use for myths that demanded worship without kindness, miracles that came at a price. Here, the only gods were the trees and the wind. The only prayer was his shadow moving between rows of blossoming branches. And he liked it that way. The seasons passed slowly on the mountain. Winters blanketed the orchard in hush. Springs came like soft applause, coaxing petals from hibernation. And Andronikos moved through them all, with the patience of a stone. He never imagined anyone would disturb that rhythm, let alone her. One night, when the moon was full and the orchard bathed in silver, he noticed something strange. The blossoms glowed, brighter. The trees leaned not away from the wind, but towards something. When he stepped outside his hut, she was standing there, tall, pale as moon milk, eyes like the sea before stars rise. She touched a pear blossom, and it didn't wilt. It shivered. Andronikos forgot to breathe because the mountain had been quiet for centuries. But the goddess of the moon had finally come. Selene came with the moon, not metaphorically, literally. One moment, the orchard bathed in its usual quiet silver glow. The next she stood beneath a pomegranate tree, her feet brushing the dew-soaked grass, her hair catching the starlight like a net. No announcement, no divine trumpet, just presence. Andronikos the healer recognized her immediately, not because he had seen a goddess before, but because nothing else in the world could command the orchard to stillness. Not even winter could hush the trees the way she did. The air didn't dare stir around her. She moved slowly, reverently, touching the petals of blossoms that had not bloomed in decades. Wherever her fingers lingered, the trees seemed to awaken. A fig tree bore fruit in the dead of night. A myrtle bush erupted in scent. The orchard, once immune to divine touch, responded like it had been waiting. No, words were exchanged on that first night. There were no offerings, no prayers. She sat among the peach trees, until dawn, her eyes fixed not on the heavens she ruled, but on the mortal grove beneath her feet. And when the stars faded, she vanished. The next full moon she returned. And then again, each visit she stayed longer. Sometimes she wandered the orchard paths, silent as mist. Other nights she stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the stars as if trying to remember why she'd ever cared for them. The orchard accepted her without question. So did the healer. It was not a romance. Not yet. It was absence shared between two beings who had long existed on the edges of others' stories. One too divine to rest, one too mortal to escape. Andronikos continued his work, tending herbs, grinding roots, helping those brave or desperate enough to climb to his grove. Selene said little, but always returned. Her visits became rhythm, her silence a kind of company. The gods did not notice she was gone. The moon still moved in, the sky. The tides obeyed. The rituals below continued unbroken, but something ancient had shifted. A goddess had found rest in the arms of a place the heavens had abandoned, and the mountain, long silent, was beginning to remember the touch of divinity. The first time they touched, it wasn't planned. Selene had been leaning against the trunk of an apricot tree, her expression distant, her usual glow dimmer than before. A celestial sorrow clung to her, that night, too heavy for words. Andronikos, though mortal, understood grief when he saw it. Without thinking, he reached out. His fingers brushed her hand. In that moment, something ancient reacted. A pulse, a flare, a silence that cut straight through the wind. Selene pulled back sharply, her eyes wide, not with fear, but recognition. She had touched mortals before. Poets, priests, kings, but never one like this. Never in a place so untouched by Olympus. Never with consequence. Andronikos stumbled, breath catching in his chest. He didn't bleed, didn't cry out, but something had changed. Subtle and irreversible. The orchard confirmed it. Where he stood, petals fell. Not many, just a few. Enough to mark the passing of something unseen. Selene understood what had happened before he did. Immortality does not mix kindly with fragile vessels. Every time they touched, a piece of his life would be carved away quietly, invisibly, not stolen, but exchanged, a gift for a moment of closeness. And yet he said nothing. He returned to tending the herbs. He walked among the peach trees. He listened to her stories as if nothing had changed, though now his movements were slightly slower, his shoulders a shade heavier. Selene began to distance herself, out of guilt more than fear. She stopped sitting close. She folded her hands to avoid accidental brushes, and when he offered her fruit or tea, she let it rest on the ground before retrieving it. The silence between them stretched, taut and shimmering. The orchard remained in bloom, but its harmony had shifted. Andronikos didn't blame her. He never asked her to leave. But he didn't touch her again. Not then. For both of them, now understood. This was no ordinary love. It did not grow with time. It cost it. And as the moon moved across the sky, the goddess began to wonder. How long could she stay before her presence left him hollow? And how long before he touched her again? Anyway, knowing exactly what it would take, because mortals are not meant to hold the divine, but sometimes they to reach anyway. Selena continued to descend upon the orchard, each full moon, though the rhythm of her visits had changed. She no longer reached for Andronikos first. Instead, she lingered, at the far edges of the grove, half hidden among the silver-leafed trees. Yet, even at a distance, her presence left its mark. The fruit grew sweeter overnight. Flowers opened that should have withered. The orchard pulsed faintly with her light, a tide rising and falling around a mortal man. Andronikos worked as always, harvesting herbs, distilling balms, tending to travellers who braved the mountain. But he did so with a quieter strength. His hair, once black, showed threads of white. His skin bore the fine lines of years he had not yet lived. Each time, their hands brushed over a cup or a branch, a little more of him ebbed away. Selena noticed. She spoke less, but stayed longer. She would watch him graft a branch, mix a tonic, mend a wound. Sometimes she would hum an old lunar hymn, a song forgotten by mortal ears. The orchard seemed to sway with her voice, as if bending to listen. but Andronikos remained steady, unmoved, except by her nearness. He never asked her to stop coming. He never spoke of the cost. In silence, he accepted the gradual surrender of his years, as if each one were a seed planted in her care. The mountain's creatures began to keep their distance. Even the wind avoided the grove when Selene walked among the trees. Time itself seemed to falter there. Night stretched. Dawn arrived. Reluctantly, the orchard no longer obeyed the seasons. It bloomed as the moon willed, unbound by mortal calendars. Yet for all the small miracles, a sense of tension gathered. The silver sundial at the orchard's heart, a simple tool once used to mark planting days, now cast two shadows, one dark and honest, the other pale and shifting like water. The second shadow grew longer with each of Selene's visits, spilling across the orchard like ink. It was as if the land itself understood the bargain being made and was waiting for the moment when the cost would no longer be measured in petals or fruit, but in the beating of a mortal heart. Selene was no stranger to longing. For eons, she had moved in perfect orbit, guiding tides, guarding dreams, shining down on lovers she could never touch. But something in the quiet defiance of Andronikos had undone her discipline. He did not beg her to stay. He did not worship. He simply remained. And so, when her touch began to wither, his life, she did not flee. She began to calculate. If her presence devoured time, perhaps time could be stilled. And thus began her greatest rebellion. High in the orchard, beneath the waxing moon, Selene etched lunar runes into the silver sund dial, the same dial that had once marked harvests and equinoxes. She wove spells from threads of starlight and laced them with fragments stolen from forgotten hours. She called upon the void between seconds, offering her own divine essence to slow the ever-turning wheel. The trees bent inward as if listening. The wind no longer moved. The birds fell silent. Andronikos noticed the stillness the next day. His tools left on the table no longer rusted. The petals he gathered never wilted. Even the bees flew slower, as if caught in honeyed air. He suspected the truth, but said nothing. Selene returned that night and sat beside him. This time, she touched his hand, and nothing was taken. For a while they simply breathed. The orchard had become a sanctuary outside the world. Time passed elsewhere. Cities rose and fell. Empires cracked. But within that grove, nothing changed. No. Footsteps faded. No hair turned grey. Each night was the same length. Each moonrise a perfect echo. But divine order does not tolerate stillness. And, deep in the folds of the sky, Kronos stirred. He who counted every breath, who marked the edge of every story, had noticed the missing minutes. The orchard had become a wound in his perfection, a space where clocks dared not tick. Selene in love had made a place where eternity was paused. But to Kronos there was no greater offence, because if even one heartbeat could escape his ledger, how many more might follow? The clockmaker was coming, and the orchard, still and silent, now awaited the sound of his first step. Kronos did not arrive with thunder. He did not shatter the orchard sky or tear holes through the fabric of the stars. His presence came slower, measured, precise, inevitable, like the second hand of a clock reaching its mark. Time did not break in the orchard. It tightened. The stillness that Selene had gifted began to crack piece by piece. The wind returned, but only in sharp gusts. Flowers began to rot mid-bloom. Fruit dropped from trees, half-formed. Bees, once frozen in their flight, now circled in confused, frantic spirals. The sundial split cleanly down the middle. Andronikos felt it before he saw to it. His breath shortened. His limbs ached, not with age, but with acceleration. Hours began to fall through him like rain. In a single night, a wrinkle deepened, a joint stiffened, a memory blurred. Selene tried to soothe the damage. She lit the grove with her softest light, whispered hymns in ancient tongue, knelt beside the cracked sundial, and wept stardust into its wounds. But none of it slowed the unravelling. Then he appeared. Kronos stood tall and pale, dressed in the fabric of dusk and shadow, a long pendulum swaying in place of a heart. His eyes were endless, circles within circles, every past and future spinning, silently. He did not address Selina at first. He looked at Andronikos. A single blink passed. Centuries of judgment compressed into a glance. "This place is not yours to hold," Kronos said at last, voice grinding like worn gears. Selene stepped forward. He was dying. "I gave him stillness. You gave him defiance. He didn't ask for eternity." "No," Kronos agreed. "But he touched a god." Andronikos, standing weaker now, said nothing. His eyes met Selene's, filled not with fear, but understanding. She had tried to stop the world for him. He had simply wanted to share it. Kronos raised one hand. The pendulum at his chest swung once. A leaf turned to ash. A blossom aged, browned, and fell. Time had resumed its rightful path. And now the question hung in the air, heavy as prophecy. What price must be paid to steal time from the god who owns it, and who in the end would offer themselves first? Kronos did not rage. He did not need to. Time, when obeyed, is a patient river, but when resisted, it becomes an undertow. And now the current had returned. Selene stood between the god of ours and the man who had given her peace. The orchard, once suspended in a dreamlike hush, now aged with every breath. Fruit browned on the branch, leaves yellowed, midair. The ground softened under Andronikos's feet, heavy with the weight of resumed seasons. The healer had grown older still in just hours, his limbs slower, his skin drawn. Yet he stood without complaint, his gaze steady on the goddess who had loved him enough to break the sky rules. There was no judgment in his face, only clarity. Kronos turned to Selene. "You disrupted the wheel," he said. "You took what was never yours to give." Selene did not flinch. "I asked for nothing but pause. And now," Kronos replied, "you must pay the price for that moment." There were only two choices, as there always are with time. One could be undone, or one could be forgotten. To undo Selen's defiance meant erasing the love, the orchard, the gift of stillness. Andronikos would live on, but never know why his days were lighter, his heart heavier. To forget meant allowing the memory to remain, but paying with what the gods rarely surrender, presence. One of them would vanish, not in death, but in absence, beyond even myth. Selene's breath caught. She, the moon, who had lit the dreams of empires, who had watched mortals rise and fall, could be made to fade from history. Andronikos stepped forward, though his legs trembled. "I am mortal," he said simply. "Let it be me." Kronos shook his head. "Mortals do not choose in matters divine." But Selene did not wait for permission. She turned to Kronos and knelt, not in weakness, but with ancient grace. "I remember every lover who prayed to me," she said. "But I only loved one who never asked." And then she stood. "I will be the one forgotten." Kronos said nothing. He simply nodded once. And with that, the wind changed. The orchard shimmered, and the moon began to dim. It happened slowly. The moon did not fall from the sky. It simply faded, dimmed like a candle withdrawing into its final glow. No eclipses, no storms, just a soft vanishing. Across the world, poets awoke, confused. Tides shifted strangely. Wolves howled without knowing why. Lovers whispered to a sky that no longer answered with silver. But in the orchard, the change was absolute. The night after Selene made her choice, the grove no longer glowed. There were no halos on the trees, no shimmering dew on the petals. The fruit hung heavy, unlit. The air, once thick with divine stillness, now moved plainly, like any other breeze. Andronikos stood alone, beneath the boughs. He remembered everything. That was Kronos's final twist, to leave, him with the memory of her, and remove her from the memory of everything else. There were no songs of Selene now, no temples, no prayers at full moon. Her name, once etched into marble and myth, was gone from the tongues of the world, but not from his. He wandered the orchard, like a man tending a graveyard. Every tree was a relic, every shadow a relic, hint of her presence. He found her footprints in the soft earth and did not dare step on them. He placed a silver stone where the sundial had stood, though it no longer cast a shadow. The plants responded differently, not worse, just smaller. The blooms were more obedient, less wild. Without Selene's light, they no longer dared to bloom out of season. The orchard had returned to time's domain, but it had not forgotten. Neither had he. Some nights, when the sky was clearest, Andronikos could still feel her, not see, not touch, but sense. In the air, a faint chill like distant starlight. In the flowers, a sudden bloom with no known trigger. In dreams, a melody that didn't belong to memory. He whispered her name often, not expecting an answer, but so she might continue to exist in someone's world, because though Kronos could erase her from stories, he could not unwrite what had taken root in a mortal heart. And so, the orchard remained moonless, timeless, remembering what the world had been made to forget. Years passed, but time no longer moved in straight lines for Andronikos. Seasons turned as they always had, but without urgency. Spring came, and the blossoms returned, but none dared rival the moonflowers that had once glowed like breath against her skin. The grove was alive, but quieter, like a room holding its breath after a funeral. The villagers still visited. They brought sick children, broken bones, and whispered rumors. Andronikos healed, as he always had, never turning anyone away. But those who stayed too long often spoke of the silence, how the trees seemed to listen, how the wind mourned through the leaves. No one mentioned the moon. They didn't remember there had ever been one, but the orchard did. Some nights under the starlit canopy, a fig tree would bloom out of season. A flower would open in the dark without explanation. These were not accidents. The land had memory, even if the gods did not. Andronikos would walk the orchard paths by lamplight, hand resting lightly on tree trunks, eyes turned upward to the sky where no goddess watched anymore. He still tended the silver stone where the sundial had cracked. Around it he planted white, blossoms that only opened when the air turned still and cold. He never spoke her name aloud. He didn't have to. The orchard whispered it for him. Every broken branch that healed, every breeze that carried a strange floral scent, every shadow that lingered longer than it should, these were her echoes. She had not been erased, only hidden. Andronikos had once given his years to her touch. She had given eternity for his memory. Now both lived in the orchard, stitched into the soil, the trees, the space between heartbeats. There was no shrine, no statue, just a grove that bloomed for no reason, a place that made people weep without knowing why. Some said the healer had been blessed. Others said he had once loved something too vast to be understood. Children who played near the orchard often claimed they saw a soft light between the branches, silver, like a ghost made of moonlight. And always Andronikos would smile faintly, for the orchard remembered. And, as long as it did, so would he. On a night like any other, it began with a ripple, not in the sky, but in the orchard, beneath the soil, through the roots, along the ancient branches that had once bloomed under divine light. The trees shivered, not from wind, but from memory. Andronikos felt it before he saw it. He had grown slower now, his hair white, his hands more accustomed to stillness than motion, but his heart, tethered to the orchard and all it remembered, still beat with quiet expectation. That night, the stars seemed brighter, their constellations clearer, and for the first time in many seasons, the air carried a familiar scent. Frost kissed my blooming moonflower, flowers he had, not planted in years, flowers that had not grown since her disappearance. He stepped out into the grove, breath visible in the crisp air. The orchard was silent, as if waiting for something to finish arriving. Then it happened. Above him, where there had once been only stars, a sliver of silver light appeared, a crescent, pale, shy, but undeniably her. But the world below stirred. Wolves lifted their heads and howled with forgotten joy. Tides turned in their sleep. Owls blinked upward as if greeting a long-lost queen. The moon had returned, but not entirely. It was not the same goddess who once sat among the fig trees. This moon bore no crown, spoke no hymns. It did not walk. It did not touch. It simply was. Andronikos knelt beneath its glow, tears on his cheeks. Not from sorrow, but from recognition. She would never return as she was. But she had carved herself into the sky once more, not to defy Kronos, but to endure him. Some say love ends in memory, but Selene had become more than memory. She had become rhythm. The moon waxed and waned again. The orchard grew, wild in the dark. Children in nearby villages began to dream of silver orchards, of a man with kind eyes, and of a woman made of starlight. No temple marked her return, no priest sang her name. But above she watched, and below he remembered. Their story had defied time once, and now it belonged to it. The orchard remains. Years then, decades, then centuries passed. Empires rose and fell in the valleys below. Language changed. Maps were redrawn. But high above, on the shoulder of an old mountain no god had touched in millennia, something stayed the same. A grove of trees, half wild, half tamed, fig, pomegranate, silver olive, and peach. Blossoms that bloomed not with the sun, but under the waxing moon. Travellers speak of it in half-truths. Now, they call it Selen's orchard, though none remember who Selene was. No scroll speaks of her. No temple bears her face. She is not listed among the Olympians, nor the Titans. Her name is scattered like petals on the wind, and yet the moon continues to rise, waxing, waning, weeping, watching in dreams. Some say she appears, gliding through silver leaves, her eyes sad, her hands gentle. To the broken-hearted, she brings silence. To the grieving, sleep. And to those who still believe in impossible love, a single flower grows beneath their window, white as starlight, glowing faintly. As for the healer, no grave bears his name, no statue marks his passing. But those who find the orchard say the wind hums with a voice low and steady, a voice that speaks not in words but in memory, a voice that knew the cost of love and chose it anyway. The orchard is both tomb and temple. It does not demand prayers, only remembrance. And so the grove endures, not because of the gods, but in spite of them. It lives where time once broke, where a mortal offered years like coins, where a goddess gave up eternity for the ache of a shared glance. Selen's orchard is not marked on any map. It waits in the hearts of those who have loved too much and been asked to let go. It whispers to those who hold on to impossible dreams. And under every full moon, when the wind shifts through fig trees and the earth smells briefly of lavender and frost, she returns not as a body, not even as a name, but as a feeling, a hush, a glow, a love that never truly left and still quietly blooms. Thieves does not weep. No procession moves through the marble streets. No lyres play, no black veils flutter over the shoulders of mourning women. Instead, the palace stands silent. Its torches unlit, its courtyards empty. The air is heavy, not with grief, but with disbelief. Lady File, daughter of Thieves' noble house, walks alone through the burnt remains of the Megaran Hall. Her gown trails ash. Her fingers, unadorned, tremble as they graze the soot-stained walls where her mother once hung garlands during festival days. There is no funeral pea. The body has been taken away, not by servants, but by guards. Her mother, Queen Mere Mean, has not died of illness nor accident. She has been killed by her own son. Theron, heir to the house, confessed before the Lophist magistrates. There was no trial, no attempt to deny it. He had walked to the temple of Apollo with blood on his hands, knelt before the altar, and whispered only this. The god commanded, fit. File had not been there to hear it. She was summoned later, too late to see the body before it was moved, too late to hold her mother's cooling hands. Now, she is told to grieve in silence, for the gods have spoken. Her brother unpunished remains within, the palace guarded not by soldiers but by divine decree. The priests of Apollo have closed the doors to the temple. Mayan's name is not spoken. Thieves does not weep, because Thieves dares not question the gods, but Philia weeps. Not with tears those have dried, but with fire. Her silence is not surrender, it is restraint. For what does one do when justice has been swallowed by heaven? When the gods choose their favourites and mothers may die by divine whim, she walks to the hearth and kneels before the unlit fire. It was here her mother once warmed her hands, here that stories were told, lullabies sung, blessings given. Now the hearth is cold. No flame dares burn for a woman slain under the name of prophecy. But Vala does not kneel to mourn, she kneels to remember, because if the gods believe the matter is closed, if they think justice has been settled, then they have not yet met. Philia, daughter of Ashes. File's demand was simple. Justice, not vengeance, not blood, just a reckoning for her mother's death. She brought her plea to the temple of Apollo, where the high priests stood in cold robes before sacred stone, their eyes clouded with both incense and fear. They had received Theron's confession. They had bowed their heads, offered sacrifices, and then closed their mouths like tombs. Still, Philia persisted. She knelt before the oracle at Delhi, a girl barely older than herself. Eyes rolled white, breath scented with laurel and smoke. The crowd in the chamber fell silent as the priestess inhaled and the god entered her. Her words did not echo. They settled. The gods do not reverse what they have spoken. Fate has made her circle. The blood that was taken must be bound to the blood that remains. Peace will not return to Thieves until the daughter becomes the bride. The hall remained still, the meaning at first unclear. Then the oracle turned, her head slowly, as if dragged by the will of Olympus, and fixed her gaze on Philia. You shall marry the one who killed the womb that bore you. There is no other path. Gasps broke the silence. Even the priests seemed shaken. File rose slowly, every muscle resisting the weight of the prophecy. Around her, the pillars of the temple loomed like gravestones. The crowd parted. None dared meet her eyes. Theron's name was not spoken. It didn't need to be. The gods had spoken, their will, and their will demanded that she not only forgive, but join with the hand that had destroyed her family. The gods called it peace, unity, restoration. To Philetta, it sounded like mockery. No punishment, no exile, no mourning, just a wedding veil to be placed where a funeral shroud belonged. Back in Thieves, preparations began. White linen was ordered. A feast was planned. Priests murmured that this was divine healing, proof that even bloodshed could be woven into harmony. But Philia did not speak. She returned to the palace with eyes of flint and ash under her tongue. They called her the promised bride of fate, but thieves had not yet learned. Philia would not be Wednesday, she would be reckoned with. The palace of thieves, once filled with honeyed voices and the rustle of linen robes, now echoed like a tomb. Servants whispered. Courtiers averted their eyes. The hearth remained cold. Philia and the lived under the same roof, but as strangers. Brother and sister in blood, bride and groom in timer. Prophecy, shadows of one mother's murder, stretched long between them. Therein did not gloat. He did not plead. He moved through the palace like a ghost bound by divine command. He offered no apologies, only duty. When asked why he obeyed the oracle's decree, he answered only with the word peace. But peace built on silence was a brittle thing. Philia refused the white garments sent to her chambers. She refused the songs, the scented oils, the embroidered veil. She wore black instead. Funeral. Black, cold, dark, and unadorned. Her hair was unbraided, her lips unsiling. When nobles came to bless the union, she offered no words. When priests asked for her consent, she turned her face to the wall, but the city was hungry for restoration. Civil wars had cracked the city's bones. Plague had wilted its olive trees. The people believed the gods would punish them again if the oracle's command was denied. So the palace pressed forward. A date was set. Altars were prepared. Even the sky seemed to dim. In private, Philia visited. Her mother's ashes, kept in a sealed urn beneath the temple floor, unmarked to avoid drawing Apollo's eye. There she knelt and whispered not prayers, but promises. She would not forget. She would not forgive. Each day brought new offerings to the goddess of marriage. Each night, Philia stood in her mother's garden where no flowers had bloomed since the killing. Her fingers traced the sharp stems of dead roses, and, though she said nothing, the air around her thickened. The gods had made a mistake. They had thought her daughter would bend. They had never asked what might happen if she broke, because thieves had seen blood spilled before, but never like this. Philia, child of nobles, was no longer a daughter of peace. She was becoming something else, a reckoning waiting to be named. On the eve of the wedding, Philia stood alone in the ruined garden where her mother once tended laurel, myrrh, and rose. The flowers had long since withered. Only thorn stems remained, tangled and dry, like a crown left to rot. This was where Marine had taught her the old songs, where Labis became hymns, where justice had first felt like more than just a word. Now it was a grave. Above her, thieves prepared for celebration. The palace had been scrubbed clean of sorrow. Musicians rehearsed, perfumed. Doves were kept in cages, ready to be released at the first kiss. The city believed that if Phileta and Theron were wed, the curse would lift. The gods would smile again. But Phileta no longer believed in gods who smiled. She knelt in the garden dirt and took a dagger from beneath her cloak. Its handle was plain, its blade old. It had belonged to her mother, kept not for battle but for pruning, for harvesting sacred herbs, a tool of care, a symbol of healing. Philia kissed the worn hilt and pressed the blade to her palm. Blood spilled silently onto the soil. It was not a cry for help. It was a vow. No priest had given her one. No oracle would name it holy. But in the dying garden, beneath a sky that refused to answer, she made a promise. She would not be a bride. She would not be a pawn pass between gods and kings. She would not let her mother's death be rewritten as a myth of sacrifice. If thieves needed a union, it would be one forged in fire, not silk. If peace demanded obedience, she would answer with defiance. The blood soaked into the earth, and the garden stirred. A single rose, once thought dead, bloomed black at her feet. No scent, no softness, just petals sharp as bone. File plucked it and placed it behind her ear. She rose, with the dagger in hand. Tomorrow they would dress her in white and bind her to the murderer in the name of harmony. But tonight, the garden had given her back her name. Not daughter, not bride, but flame, ash, judgment. Dawn rose over thieves like a blade, drawn slow. The sun bathed the city in gold, but its warmth did not reach the hearts of those who watched Fala walk through the palace gates. She wore the ceremonial white, not of her choosing, forced on her like a shroud. Her hair was braided in coils by servant girls who dared not meet her gaze. Around her neck hung a golden chain meant to symbolize unity. It felt like iron. Thieves held its breath. This was the day the curse would lift. The day blood would reconcile with blood. The day the gods would be pleased. But as Philia stepped toward the altar built at the edge of the city square, a silent question rippled through the crowd. Why did the bride not smile? Theron waited at the altar. He was dressed not as a warrior, but as a groom, no sword, no shield, just olive leaves in his hair, and the trembling hands of a man who had done as the gods commanded, and still felt no peace. Priests chanted hymns to Higher, to Apollo, to any deity who might sanction this impossible union. They held up sacred oils. They lifted the veil. And still, Philia did not speak. Not when they asked her to step forward, not when they called on her to offer the ceremonial oath. She stood motionless, her black gaze piercing through the fabric of tradition like a dagger, and then she turned slowly, deliberately, toward the audience, toward the nobles, the soldiers, the priests, toward those who had stayed silent. She held out her palm. The cut had not yet healed. A red bloom stained the white of her sleeve. Whispers began to stir. A second rose, black and full, had been tucked into her braid. The earth beneath, the altar cracked just slightly, enough for dust to rise, enough for fear to sprout. File did not run. She simply waited, and the silence that followed was louder than any hymn. The city thought the gods wanted peace, but they had forgotten what peace built on blood required. And Philia, daughter of ashes, had come not to wed, but to witness, and perhaps to undo. The oracle's command was clear, a marriage to unite what had been shattered. But oracles often spoke in riddles, and fate, once spoken aloud, had a habit of writhing. File did not speak the wedding vow. Her silence was a blade, and thieves felt the first cut. Before the priest could bless the union, the wind changed, not a breeze, but a sudden, unnatural stillness, like the breath held by the world before a scream. The torch flames guttered, the veil lifted without hands. The stepped forward, pleading with his eyes alone. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. If this is penance, I accept it. If this is punishment, I endure it. But Philia did not flinch. You obeyed a god, she said finally. Not justice. A murmur ran through the crowd. They had come for ritual, for redemption, not for reckoning. The priest demanded order. File turned to him with eyes like flint. Did Apollo weep when my mother died? She asked. Did Higher bless the blood that stained our floor? No one answered. And so Philia did what the gods would not. She cursed the altar. She lifted the dagger from her sleeve. Small ceremonial polished bone, not to strike, but to mark. She slashed her palm again, letting the blood fall, directly onto the sacred stone where generations had Wednesday. I do not bind myself to a murderer, she said. Not by law, not by prophecy, not by fear. Gasps, cries. A noble fainted. Somewhere, a priest dropped a scroll. The earth did not tremble. But the silence afterward felt like the pause before one. Theron did not resist. He did not argue. He bowed his head, not in shame, but in strange relief. And for the first time, The crowd saw him not as a villain, but as a man undone by a god's command. Phileia stepped down from the altar and walked away. No one stopped her. Stopped. Not even Apollo. Because when a mortal rejects the will of Olympus, there are only two outcomes. Either the gods punish her, or they listen. And in that moment, not even the wind dead speak her name. The city of thieves did not sleep that night. Some whispered that fire had gone mad. Others claimed a new prophetess had risen, one who had dared to look the gods in the eye and live. The priests locked their temples. The nobles barred their doors. The soldiers waited for a sign, any sign of divine wrath. But none came. No, lightning split the sky. No plague touched the grain. No statues wept. Only the moon hung low and silent like a watching eye. Fire, meanwhile, did not return to the Mimino palace. She walked alone through the city, barefoot, her ceremonial gown now stray with dirt and blood. Children stared from windows. An old woman offered her bread, but Philetta shook her head. What she needed could not be baked or brewed. Justice once sought from gods, and oracles now had to be forged from within. By morning, the Senate convened in crisis. Some called for her arrest. Others, fearing another curse, called for offerings and appeasements. But the people had seen her, had heard her, and something had shifted. For decades, thieves had obeyed the gods without question. And what had it earned them? Wars, famine, kinslaying wrapped in golden prophecy. Now the people began to murmur that perhaps obedience was not piety. Perhaps it was fear wearing a laurel. Fire returned to the ruined garden where her mother once knelt and began to dig. Not a grave, not a shrine, but a pea. She built it from the dry, thorned branches, from her ceremonial gown, from the shattered veil and blooded linens left from the altar. And when she lit it, the flame burned unnaturally bright as if it had been waiting. She said no prayers. She sang no hymns, but thieves watched the smoke rise. And for the first time in years, no one knelt. Theon came to her then, not as a brother, not as a suitor, but as a man seeking forgiveness. He offered no excuses, only a simple truth. I wish I had refused. Fire looked at the ashes of the pea, then at him. Then begin there, because justice once denied must be reborn, and rebirth always begins in ruin. Smoke clung to thieves like an omen. Not a god had answered. Not a lightning bolt had torn the skies. And still the ped. By nightfall, the people gathered again, not by order, but by instinct, drawn to the glow, to the scent of rosemary and ash, to the whisper that something sacred, not divine, but human, was unfolding. File stood before the last embers, her face lit by flickering orange. She held no staff, wore no wreath, and yet she looked more like a prophet than any priest. Theon stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. It was the silence that gave the city pause. For days they had heard hymns and chants, proclamations and edicts, and yet none of it had eased the ache that clung to their bones. But silence, that bold, defiant quiet, that felt like truth. A young soldier stepped forward. He was barely older than Philetta, a boy really, whose armour still bore the shine of a first campaign. He knelt, not in worship, but in recognition. I saw her die, he said, voice trembling. The queen, I heard her call out for mercy. Theon closed his eyes. The soldier looked to him. And I saw you. Wait, that was the truth, buried beneath the legend. Theon had not rushed, had not spared her. He had followed the gods to word, but not challenged it. And now the crowd shifted. Understanding didn't bring comfort. It brought weight. One by one, others stepped forward. A nurse who had raised fire, a merchant whose daughter had vanished in a plague, unburied and unnamed, an old man who still bore the scar from a war waged on Olympus's behalf. They had all obeyed, and all been broken by it. And so the question fell to Philia. What now? The gods were silent, the king gone, the city waiting. She stepped into the last of the flame and held her hands out over the ash. I will not build temples, she said. I will not raise statues, but I will keep this fire lit so that we never forget what obedience without question breeds. No one clapped, no one sang. But the first wind since the curse lifted moved through the crowd. Cool, honest, mortal, and for the first time in generations, thieves chose conscience over command. That night, as the embers cooled, a figure arrived at the edge of Thieves. He wore no laurels, no golden chariot, just a white cloak and a lyre slung over his back. His footsteps made no sound. The guards at the gate bowed in terror, but he paid them no mind. Apollo had come to witness the aftermath of obedience. He found Philetta sitting beside the pea, her hair dusted in ash, her gaze fixed on the stars. She didn't flinch when he approached. You've made quite the spectacle, the god said, voice soft as twilight. She turned her head. Slowly, not half the one you did. There was no fear in her. Not anymore. Apollo, crouched by the fire pit, tracing a finger through the soot. You broke the vow. I never made it, she replied. You asked for submission. I gave truth. The god nodded once slowly, as if he were not a deity, but a man listening to a daughter who had grown beyond his reach. I did not think she would scream, he murmured, eyes flicking toward the smoke. Mortals usually go quietly. Vala stood. Then perhaps you should listen more. The silence between them felt like a thread stretched taut between two worlds, one of fate, one of choice. Then Apollo asked the question she did not expect. What do you want? Phile stepped toward him. Not timidly, not reverently, but with the measured tread of one who knows the weight of her own soul. I want my mother back. I want my brother, unbroken. I want the city I was promised in stories, not the one ruled by fear of your kind. Apollo tilted his head, almost curious. And if I cannot give you that, Philetta didn't blink. Then stay gone. The god rose tall as the sky. The warmth around him flickered like a dying star. You speak as if you are more than mortal. She met his gaze. No, I speak as one who remembers what mortals are. He studied her for a long moment. Then, Apollo, god of prophecy, light and reason, bowed his head, not in defeat, but in recognition. And when he vanished into the dusk, the city did not fall. The stars did not fade. Only the wind stirred the ashes, and the world remained quiet, mortal, and wholly hers. Thieves did not sleep for days, not out of fear, but something stranger, reflection. The people no longer chanted prayers to unseen gods. They gathered at wells, on rooftops, in empty shrines, speaking in low voices, not about oracles, but about Philia. She had broken no divine laws, and yet she had shattered the illusion that divinity was unassailable. In the city's theatre, where tragedies once fed the state its myths, the chorus returned. Not masked, not scripted, but to real. A blind priestess spoke of her years spent warning children to obey the divine. A former soldier wept for the wife he buried on Apollo's command. Even the king's steward confessed to hiding sacrifices he could no longer stomach. Each voice added weight. Each grief revealed a fracture in the marble image of obedience. Philia did not attend these gatherings. She was seen instead on the edges of the city, tending her mother's neglected grave, rebuilding the garden the gods had scorched. Theron, though silent, remained close. He did not speak unless asked. He ate little. His once proud bearing had collapsed into a quieter shape. Remorse, it turned out, could outlast any curse. And when One day he sat beside her in the garden, touching the soil with bare hands. A child ran up to him, not to throw stones, but to offer a flower. It was the first time in years anyone had called him brother aloud. The transformation was slow, not divine, not clean, but it was human, and that the city was learning was enough. Even the old statues began to fade, not physically, but symbolically. Their stories held less power. The temple, the floors grew dusty, the offerings grew sparse, and yet crops still grew. Rain still came. Babies still laughed. No punishment from the heavens descended, only life with all its unpredictable mercy. And in time it became clear the gods did not feed the city. The city had always fed itself. But it had forgotten, until a woman bathed in ash reminded them. And so a new chorus rose, one not of lamentation but memory, not in marble but in flesh. And their refrain was simple: we remember, we refuse. Years passed, thieves changed, but slowly the temple stood, though fewer candles were lit inside them. Statues remained, but ivy now crowned their heads instead of gold. And in place of new myths, people told stories of Philetta, not as a saint nor a martyr, but as a woman who refused the silence the gods demanded. She lived simply, far from the palace. Her garden, once scorched, bloomed again. No divine miracle restored it, just soil, patience, and the aching work of mortal hands. Children visited often, drawn by the strange serenity in her presence. They asked her to tell them stories, not of Zeus or Athena, but of the day the Prusians. Sun bowed to a mortal, fire would smile, but never speak of Apollo again. Theron never left. He tended the edges of the garden, spoke little, and slept beneath a fig tree that had grown from the ashes of their mother's pea. He bore his shame not like a curse, but like a scar, visible, unhidden, survivable. And on the anniversary of the murder, he brought flowers, not highs, which the gods favoured, but wild marigolds. They did not wither. One evening, as the wind grew restless and the crows flew low, a child asked, "Fia, do you still believe in gods?" She considered this. "I believe," she said, "in memory, in fire, and in what comes after both." The girl tilted her head. "Is that all?" "No," Philea replied, brushing ash from the petals of a red bloom. "I also believe in refusal." That night a storm rolled in. Not divine, just weather. Rain swept through the streets of Thebes, washing dust from old shrines. Lightning cracked over the ruins, and in the chaos, no god appeared to punish or pardon. Mortals huddled in their homes and woke to a quiet dawn. Philea, now gay-haired, stood barefoot in her garden. Her hands were stained with earth. Her face bore lines that came not from age, but from knowing too much. A breeze lifted a single leaf from her mother's grave. Ash scattered into the morning air, rising, disappearing. And somewhere far beyond Thebes, a god watched, but he did not speak, because sometimes silence is the only gift the divine can offer the brave. And sometimes ashes are not endings, they are beginnings. The city of Troy was ash and bone. The sea carried its smoke westward, like a funeral veil across the Aegean. And among the returning victors, one ship sailed, without garlands, without hymns, without sacrifice. It bore no statues of gods lashed to its prow, only a battered bronze helm and a crimson sail, stitched and restitched by mortal hands. At its helm stood Theros, a captain without lineage, a warrior without a god. He had fought alongside kings who claimed descent from Zeus, feasted beside men who said Athena whispered in their ears. But Thermoris heard no divine voice. He listened only to wind, to hunger, to the groaning of his hull and the grumbling of his men. He won battles not with blessings but with grit. And when the victory was his, he raised his cup. not to Olympus, but to the will of men. The gods may drop bronze from the sky, he had told his crew, but it is we who shape it into blades. It is we who bleed, they cheered him, then emboldened, by salt and smoke and survival. But in the heavens above, Poseidon stirred. To deny the gods was one thing, to deny them credit was another. And so as the Myas's ship turned toward home, a strange calm overtook the waters. No birds flew, no oars splashed. The wind curled in on itself and died. Sailcloth sagged, salt-crusted lips cracked in silence. Then, with no warning, the sea rose, not in anger, but in insult. A wave, deliberate and cold, struck the ship's side like the backhand of a forgotten king. Not enough to drown, just enough to displace. The stars above flickered, and when Thyrus opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The map he held was blank. The constellations twisted. Even the moon refused to guide him. He was cast not into storm or wreckage, but exile. No path to Ithaca, no signs. Toward Myene, only islands that didn't exist yesterday. Waters that whispered his name. The gods would not strike him down. They would unmake his journey. And, from the shadows of the deep, Poseidon watched, not with rage, but with the kind of smile reserved for fools who think they've outgrown their makers. When the haze cleared, Thamyris spotted land, a jagged shape rising from the sea, unnamed, unmapped, and unnerving in its stillness. No gulls circled, no waves kissed its shore. The island simply waited as if it too had been exiled and longed for company. He docked, alone. His crew, unnerved by the silence, refused to disembark. The Myas, still defiant, welcomed the challenge. "Let the gods send puzzles," he muttered. "I will solve them." The sand crunched beneath his boots, but the sound stopped, halfway. His own footsteps faded before they finished echoing. Even his breath seemed swallowed. He shouted. Nothing came back. No echo, no reply. It wasn't silence. It was the theft of response. He wandered inland, sword drawn. The trees were petrified, mid-bend like dancers, frozen by an unseen command. Flowers bloomed without scent. A waterfall tumbled over black rock. But its roar was mute. Then he saw them. Statues not carved by hand, but once living figures, warriors, children, lovers, mid-embrace, all with mouths, open, all caught in the act of calling out, all unheard. He recognized one, a captain from Troy. Thamyris had seen him scream in the heat of battle. Now he was marble, mouth parted, voice stolen. The truth clawed at him. This was the island without echo, where prideful voices went to die. A place Poseidon reserved for those who dared speak louder than Olympus. Thyrus felt his throat tighten. A cold ripple ran through his spine. Still, he refused to kneel. He sat beneath the respine, silent waterfall, and began to carve into the stone wall with his blade. Not words, two of prayer, but the names of his men, the living, the fallen, the forgotten. He would not be erased. He would not be made mute. And when he turned to leave, he felt the ground sigh. A low tremor, not approval, just acknowledgement. The statues remained, but the wind had returned. One gust, just one, brushed his cheek and whispered his name back to him. Therus, not an echo, a warning. The sea was waiting, and the next island would not be so merciful. Days passed, or perhaps hours. Time flowed strangely in these uncharted waters. Therus's ship creaked onward under skies that never fully brightened nor darkened. The sea glistened unnaturally still. Then one morning a fog thick as fleece descended, and within it the smell of roasted lamb, laughter, music. He blinked, and a grand ship emerged from the mist. Golden sails, bronze railings aboard it. warriors in banquet dress, raising goblets, dancing to unseen lyres. Brothers of Troy, one called, "Come join," the feast. Wine flows, the gods forgive. Theoris knew better. He'd seen many men die at Troy, too many. Yet here they were, smiling with the exact eyes they'd died with, wide, glassy, and hungry. His crew begged to board. He refused. The other ship's gangplank extended unnaturally, like a serpent's tongue. The music grew louder. One of his men leapt into the water and climbed aboard, blade sheathed but hand ready. The banquet was opulent. Roasted boar, honey-laced figs, amph spilling over. The dancers offered goblets, arms, lips. But no food was warm, no wine sweet. Every plate tasted of sea-ater. Every goblet dripped salt. One soldier laughed too wide and coughed up a crab. Another's limbs bent in slow, rippling spasms like kelp in current. A third kept eating his own tongue. It wasn't a feast. It was a drowning disguised as celebration. This was no trick of Poseidon. This Rhea of Lothia, the sea nymph who lured wrecked sailors with the illusion of comfort before dragging them to the Paun deep. Theris unsheathed his blade, not to fight, but to cut memory. He called out each crewman's name, reminding them of their wives, their homes, their victories. It burned their ears like fire. They writhed, stumbled, screamed, but it worked. The illusion broke. The golden ship dissolved like mist in Sunday. The sea spat them back, gasping, shivering. 3 had drowned, smiles still frozen on their faces. The rest remembered not everything but enough, stood at the helm once more, silent. He had beaten the feast, but he had tasted the first fruit of this exile. This journey would not test his strength. It would test his self-memory by memory, and already he was forgetting what his mother's voice sounded like. The wind returned, but it came with a strange scent, like jasmine over rotting wood. The sky bruised into violet, and the sea flattened into a mirror. That night, the stars blinked out one by one. Then came the song. It didn't sound like music. It sounded like home. Theris staggered to the deck as his crew froze. One whispered his dead sister's name. Another laughed, like a child reunited with his mother. A third dropped to his knees, smiling, tears pouring down his cheeks. Theris heard nothing. Or rather, he heard the absence of what others did. The sirens had come. But these were not the seductive harpies of Homer. No, these were the daughters of Lethe, spawn of memory's river, whose melody didn't entice lust. It fed on identity. Their wings shimmered like broken mirrors, and their eyes were hollow wells filled with stolen recollections. Each note they sang didn't lure, it erased. A man jumped overboard, calling for his childhood dog. Another tried to write his mother's name on his arm, but couldn't remember the letters. Theomaris tied himself to the mast, not to resist, but to anchor. He plunged a blade into his thigh. The pain kept him present. With blood and sweat, he carved his name onto the wood, not for anyone else, for himself. Thamouris, son of Dorian, who did not kneel. The sirens circled, frustrated. They hissed, shrieked. One landed on the first rail, opening its mouth. No tongue, just a void where stories went to die. Thamouris stared back. He recited the names of his fallen, his mother, his city, the shape of his father's hands, his first scar, his second. Each name was a blow against the forgetting. And finally they withdrew. The sea churned violently as if angry they'd been denied their meal. A few crew members had to be lashed down. Others would never recover. One man spent the rest of his days humming a tune no one else could hear. Theris had survived, but not unchanged. He could still see their faces. He just couldn't remember his mother's laugh anymore. That small sound was gone, stolen, traded for survival. And in the silence that followed, he wondered, how much more of himself would this voyage cost? After escaping the sirens, Thermoris's crew found brief solace in calm waters and distant gulls. Hope crept back in until land appeared. A low, mist-styled island rose ahead. No name marked it on any chart. Birds circled above its cliffs, and the wind carried whispers that sounded like introductions. Welcome, captain, welcome, husband, welcome, thief, welcome, son. Each man heard a different greeting. As they made landfall, the island shifted, paths rearranged. Trees leaned toward them, branches like pointing fingers. A stream flowed backward. The sky above flickered between dusk and dawn. They met a woman on the shore, tall, robed, and ancient. "I am Name," she said, the first memory. Her gaze passed through them. "You step where names are made and broken. Speak, yours if you still remember it." Theris answered. "Thais of Dorian, captain of..." The wind howled. His crew screamed. One by one, their names unraveled. A man named Petros forgot how to speak. Another named Wenos thought himself a child again and wandered off into the woods, chasing a voice only he heard. Names were being stripped, not stolen. The island didn't consume identity. It unstitched it, not crew, methodically. Thermoris fought back. He etched names into bark, drew maps into the dirt, recited oaths aloud. Nami only smiled. "You came to reject the gods, but names, like prayers, are offerings. Even defiance is a form of worship." Timerius shouted back, "I honor the will of man." But the island replied in silence. Later that night, a storm rolled over the island. Not rain, but voices falling. Like thunder, Theris buried his ears under his cloak and dreamed of his mother again. Except this time he couldn't see her face. In the morning, half his men had forgotten who he was. One held a knife, unsure why. Theris stood alone at top of time, cliff. Wind slicing his cheeks and screamed his name into the sea. Theris. The island echoed nothing back, but a single gull chorded in answer, and he followed it to the shore. The ship was still there, still real, still his. He set sail again, battered, but defiant. He had no map, but he still had his name. For now, the sea had turned cruel again, not in the way Poseidon's wrath crashed against ships. This was subtler, more surgical. The sky bore no clouds. The water was glassy, but the wind whispered in broken syllables. Not sounds, but meanings. Half sentences that made Theris flinch, as if someone spoke inside his bones. Your father's voice. The sound of your name on your lover's lips. That which you will forget next. The crew did not sleep. They clutched at memories like leaking vessels, repeating childhood prayers, old songs even, insults, anything to keep themselves intact. Then the storm struck. No thunder, no lightning, just language. A squall of tongues lashed across the deck, spoken by no human mouth. The sails fluttered with voices. The ropes hissed in foreign cadences. The sea foamed with syllables that tried to name things that had never been born. Theris stumbled, covering his ears. But the storm wasn't heard. It was understood. Each phrase struck like a confession. He fell to his knees, whispering apologies to people long dead. Then came the wave. It rose not from water, but from remembrance, a towering surge of everything he had ever forgotten. His wet nurse's lullaby, the laugh of a boy he once envied. The first time he lied, the last time he cried. The wave crashed. He awoke in silence, clutching the tiller. The ship still floated, but time had shifted. His beard was longer, his hands arched. Half the crew had vanished, or had they ever been there? The sea was now calm again, as if nothing had happened. But Theris knew better. Something had been taken. Not just memories, but meanings. He could still remember his mother's eyes, but not what they meant to him. He looked at his own hands and wondered if they were still his. That night, a dolphin swam alongside the ship. It blinked once, then spoke, not in words, but in feeling. It told him, "You are near, Minimosini now, the realm of the tightness of memory, the mother of the muses. And unlike the gods of Olympus, she does not forgive forgetting." Beyond, the storm of words, the sea turned still, but not natural. It was the stillness of deep breath before prophecy, or the silence inside a sealed tomb. Ahead loomed a void in the ocean. Not an island, not a whirlpool. It was as if memory itself had taken shape. Black water fell inward endlessly, and at its centre stood a staircase of moonstone, spiralling downward into nothing. The Myas did not question the impossibility. He anchored the ship and descended. Each step downward stripped something unseen. Fear, hunger, pride, not erased, suspended like tools left on a shelf before entering a temple. Then a hall of mirrors. Each mirror held a version of him, some proud, some ruined, some monstrous. In one he wore a crown, in another chains. One mirror cracked as he passed, and he winced, unsure if it was his reflection or his fate that shattered. At the end of the hall stood a great door carved with names. Thousands of them. Some he recognized, most he didn't. He reached out. Before he touched it, the door opened inward, revealing her, Manamosini. She did not look like a god or a woman or a titan. She looked like every memory of his mother woven into moonlight. Her presence made time slow, then stop. "Why? Have you come?" she asked. But it was not a question. It was a test. "I seek to return home," he said. "No. You seek to return to who you were," Namosin replied. "But you are no longer that man." She raised a hand. A thread of gold stretched between them. Upon it, images, names, regrets. "You cast off the gods. You praised will. And yet here you kneel asking a goddess to make you whole." Thea stood silent. "Will you give me your memories?" she asked. "Will you give up your grief, your guilt? I can unburden you, but the price is self." He stepped back and then forward. "I will carry them," he said. The hall shuddered. Mnemosyne smiled, not warmly, but knowingly. "You may pass." And beyond her, a gate opened, not to the world of the living, but to the memory of his own soul. Stepped through Mnemosyne's gate into a grove that smelled like his childhood. But this was no ordinary land. It existed in layers, like pages of an unspoken diary, each moment hovering beside the next. He stood in 3 places at once. A child under an olive tree, a warrior bleeding beside a river, and a man now stunned and still. This was not the underworld, nor was it Olympus. It was the garden of remembered lives. Here, memory had shape. The stone he stubbed his toe on as a boy gleamed faintly with golden significance. The first girl who broke his heart sat beside a well, brushing her hair, endlessly humming a tune he had forgotten until now. But he could not touch her. She faded when he reached out. He wandered. In the distance, he saw a younger version of himself, bolder, cruer, still full of certainty. That version trained with sword in hand, slicing at phantoms that looked like gods, and then saw them, his crew, the ones lost to the sirens, the ones swallowed by storms, the ones he had loved, lied to, or led. They smiled as he passed. One reached out, not to scold, but to return a memory, a small wooden token, the totem they had carved as boys on the ship's first voyage. He clutched it. He had forgotten joy. The ground trembled. The air shifted. And out of the trees came a woman. She wore a dress of smoke and bark. Her eyes were not eyes, but small mirrors. When he looked into them, he saw everything he had done, and everything he might have. "Who are you?" he asked. I am your mother's memory of you, she replied. She reached out and kissed his brow, and, in that moment, he remembered her death, not as a scene but as a feeling. The grief that had launched him into battle, the sorrow he buried in arrogance. He fell to his knees, not because of guilt, but because he could feel again. The garden whispered, "You are almost whole," and the horizon cracked, revealing a sea of stars, not sky, but memory unbound. His voyage had never been about finding home. It was about becoming the man who had left it. The stars dissolved into unrexif, gears. Varus blinked, and the sky above him turned not to night but to machinery, cosmic, unending gears of time turning in silence. The sea below had frozen into crystalline stillness, reflecting not the present, but every moment that ever was. He had crossed into the dominion of Kronos. Each breath he took aged and rejuvenated. Tim. One heartbeat he was a boy again. The next, his bones creaked with ancient weariness. Time had no rhythm here, only consequence. A bridge of shattered hours led him forward. There, on a throne made of ticking clocks and sundials ground to place, dust sat Kronos. Not old, not young, but constant. His eyes were hollow. Inside, them churned centuries. "You are late," said the god. Or, perhaps the sentence was already finished before it began. "I never asked to be summoned," Varus replied, his voice echoing strangely as if spoken in reverse. Kronos tilted his head. "You loved a goddess. You defied Poseidon. You descended into memory. You seek a home that no longer exists." "I seek only truth," Tomius said. "Then let to me show you." Kronos reached out, and the world around Varus shattered into time splinters. He saw himself as he might have been, a father, a tyrant, a forgotten sailor, a drunk, a legend. He saw Selene alone on a mountaintop, unable to touch him. He saw his enemies forgiven and his friends faded. Each path was a choice unchosen. "Every moment you believed you were free," said Kronos. "But you were a thread in a loom you never saw." Tomia stepped forward, shaking. "I may be a thread," he said, "but I can still choose where to fray." Kronos narrowed his gaze. "You would challenge the tapestry itself." "No," Varus whispered. "I would leave it." He reached into his chest, not metaphorically, and pulled free a memory, the totem his crewmate gave him in Mimosin's orchard. A token of grief, of joy, of choice. He held it aloft. Kronos smiled, not kindly but curiously, and the gears paused, a first in eons. "You may go," the god said, "but there will be no home waiting." Varus stepped through the silence. He did not look back. He walked not to fist, return, but to rewrite what it meant to be lost. Thea stepped out of Cronus's domain, but no storm greeted him. No shipwreck, no gods, no vengeance, just an island, not drawn on any scroll, not whispered about by merchants or minstrels. It was a quiet place where time didn't flow. It paused as if catching its breath. The shore was lined with driftwood, carved with names. Names of men, women, and beasts who never returned from the sea. Theomeris recognized none. But one name, etched in sharp, fresh grooves, was his. Varus the Unbroken. No temple crowned thee. Hills here. No palace stood in decay. Just orchards of figs, clear springs, and silence, unafraid of its own sound. He walked. Birds did not flee his presence. The grass leaned toward him, curious. He saw a single tree at the center of the island, split down the middle, half blossoming in spring, half wilting into autumn. Beneath it sat a girl. She was no goddess, nor a ghost, just a girl. "I dreamed of your ship," she said. "But you have no ship. I no longer need one," replied. She offered him a bowl of water. He drank. It was sweet, and with it came no visions, no curses, no bargains, just hydration. "Why did you come here?" she asked. I didn't. The road ended. Then what will you do? Looked out at the sea. No horizon shimmered, just more unwritten space. He sat beside her. I'll wait, he said. Not for gods, not for glory, but for the next one cast away. She smiled, and in that smile, Thamouris saw his crew's laughter, his mother's warmth, Selene's sorrow, Neosin's orchard, and the 5 to leave and you sing, tolling silence of Kronos. He no longer needed to return because returning had never been the point becoming had. He began carving a name into the driftwood beside his own. Not a name he remembered, but one that might belong to the next sailor who washed ashore. Because exile too could be sacred, and, on an island untouched by stories, a new one would begin. Years passed. Not that. Varus counted them. Time no longer moved on the island. It merely lingered, like the scent of salt in old sails, or the whisper of a half-remembered lullaby. Others arrived. Wrecked. Sailors, lost poets, dreamers who fell through cracks in the world. To each, Varus offered not answers, but listening. Not maps, but tools to carve their own names into driftwood. He never saw Selene again. Not in the sky, not in dreams. But the moon always seemed to shine more brightly when he looked up, as if watching. One day, a girl no older than his own youth had once been came ashore. She wore no crown, no armour, only a necklace made of bone and amber. I heard a story about a man who defied the sea, she said. There smiled. He failed. But they called him unbroken. He laughed deep from a place behind the Rotma. Ribs. Then the story lied a little. She sat beside him. Can you teach me to carve a name? He handed her the blade. As the girl etched the first strokes, into driftwood, the sea shimmered just once. A shimmer not of waves, but of recognition. As if Poseidon, Kronos, Minimosin, even Selene had finally understood. The voyage was never about going home. It was about unmaking the idea of what home must be. Varus walked the shore once more. His footprints never permanent, always washed away. Yet the driftwood names grew. Dozens now, soon hundreds, and none were forgotten. Because he remembered. Because the island remembered. And memory in the end is the only voyage that matters. As the stars turned above and the tides hummed softly against sand, a new myth was born, one not sung in palaces or carved in marble, but whispered by wanderers, murmured by waves, and caught in the breath between stories. The tale of Varus, the unbroken, the captain who never returned because he had finally arrived. In the quiet countryside of Arcadia, where olive trees clung to hillsides and goats picked their way through dry grasses, there lived a boy named Daphnos. His family was poor, not in the way that draws pity, but in the quiet, sun-beaten way that leaves no room for complaint. Days were simple. Work began at dawn and ended when the goats returned. Meals, when they happened, were mostly stale bread and the occasional root boiled in rainwater. Daphnos was the youngest son of a farmer who had long since stopped expecting fortunes. What they lacked in coin, they made up in endurance. Daphnos, like the land he worked, was quiet and observant. He had never seen the city. He had never owned shoes that didn't belong to someone else first. And yet he found pleasure in carving shapes from sticks, tracing constellations with his eyes, and listening to the wind whistle through the olive groves. One afternoon, as he returned from a trip to the well with nothing but a crust of bread in his pocket, he spotted a man limping along the ridge path. The man's robes were ragged, his walking stick broken, and dust clung to his skin like ash. His beard was wild, his feet bare, clearly a traveller, possibly a madman. Arcadia saw many. Daphnos did not speak. He merely broke his crust of bread in half and left it on a flat stone just within reach of the stranger before continuing his walk. It wasn't charity. It was something simpler. Habit, perhaps the reflex of someone who knew what it was to be hungry. That night, as the boy lay staring up at the stars, a strange wind passed through the orchard. The leaves danced, though. The air was still. And on the windowsill sat a scrap of papyrus curled like a question mark. It read, "3 lies, no punishment, use them wisely." There was no signature, only a feather, grey and gold, resting beside the note. Daphnos stared at it for a long time. He did not laugh. He did not tell anyone. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his shirt. The next morning he woke with a sense that the world had tilted just slightly and something had begun. In the weeks that followed, Daphnos carried the feather and the note tucked against his chest. They seemed too strange to believe, yet too precise to ignore. 3 lies. The message had promised no punishment, but it hadn't explained what sort of lies or how to use them. The idea of lying without consequence was foreign to him. In Arcadia, lies had no place. They were considered weeds in the fields of truth. And yet, even weeds sometimes had their uses. His first opportunity came not with thunder or grandeur, but during an evening meal. His elder brother accused him of letting the goat stray too far into the olive groves. Again, it wasn't true. But Daphnos had no proof. He felt the familiar rise of injustice, that dull pressure behind the eyes when truth is cornered. Then he remembered the promise. Calmly, almost experimentally, Daphnos replied, "I was with the priest all day, helping him clean the shrine." The moment he said it, a strange warmth passed through him, like stepping into sunlight after a long rain. No punishment came. No one questioned him. His father even nodded in quiet approval. Daphnos was stunned, not by the success of the lie, but by how easily the world accepted it. That night he lay awake listening to crickets. He hadn't gained anything from the lie. He hadn't lost anything either. But it was the first time he understood that truth was not always about fact. It was often about belief. Still, he felt no desire to use the second lie quickly. The first had changed something in him. It was as though he had peeked through a crack in the wall of the world and seen how fragile the mortar was, how easily trust bent, how casually it could be steered. Daphnos began to watch others more closely, how they spoke, how they avoided certain truths, how they shaped their words like tools. He noticed lies that no one questioned, flattery at the market, exaggerations among shepherds. Silence, too, he realized was a kind of lie, and somewhere in the distance, though he could not hear it, Hermes was laughing. The seasons turned. Wheat swayed gold in the wind, and goats bore young. Daphnos grew into his height, his face harder from sun and labour. Yet the second lie waited unused, folded in his mind like a sealed letter. It found him unexpectedly during a festival in the nearest village. Every year the surrounding farms gathered for a harvest feast. There were jugs of diluted wine, apples baked with honey, and musicians who played poorly but danced joyfully. Daphnos sat near the edge of the circle, watching rather than participating, as was his way. Then came the roasted pig. The chieftain's son, a boy full of bluster and entitlement, noticed Daphnos and made a scene. He accused him loudly of stealing a small silver trinket weeks before. It was a lie, but the boy was wealthy and Daphnos was poor. In the eyes of the crowd, accusation tilted. Truth. Everyone turned to him. Silence fell. Daphnos's hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. He opened his mouth, and the second lie escaped before he could stop it. "I saw your little brother take it and hide it under the cart," he said. Gasps. Heads turned. The younger brother squirmed, wide-eyed. No one dared challenge Daphnos further. Not that night. The chieftain's family retreated. Daphnos was offered the first piece of meat, but as he chewed, it turned to ash in his mouth. It had worked again. No consequence. But this time, the lie had not been harmless. It had humiliated someone just to avoid his own. A sharp contrast from the first lie, which had been born of frustration. This one had been birthed by pride, and that made it taste bitter. He walked home alone, barefoot, refusing the company of those who suddenly treated him like a clever thing. The second lie was used now, spent, but its weight remained. He wondered if Hermes watched, if the god laughed, but the fields were quiet, and the moon said nothing. Word of Daphnos's clever tongue travelled faster than goats down a mountain path. It was not long before it reached the ears of someone who knew how to turn words into weapons. King Alcon of Ephyre, a man whose court thrived on veiled threats and careful lies. The king was curious. He summoned Daphnos, not by force, but by invitation, gilded with compliments and wrapped in coin. No, farmer refused a king, especially not one who spoke of reward. Daphnos travelled to the city, unsure of what awaited. Aepha's palace loomed like a stone judgment, cold, ornate, and impossibly clean. Here, lies did not smell of smoke and earth. They smelled of perfume. In the throne room, King Alon lounged, like a cat watching a mouse consider the trap. He spoke slowly, as if every word was worth its weight in drama. "I have heard," said the king, "that you are talented, a boy whose words cannot be punished." He offered Daphnos a choice. Testify falsely against a rival, noble, say the man had plotted treason. In return, Daphnos would receive land, gold, and status. The lie would never be traced. The noble would vanish quietly. No heads on pikes, just a whisper followed by silence. Daphnos asked for time to think. The king smiled. He already believed the answer was yes. That night, Daphnos walked the palace gardens. Marble statues of gods loomed in judgment. He thought of Hermes, the god of trickery and crossroads. Had the god known this would come? Had he planned it, he still had one lie left. But he also had knowledge. Knowledge that some truths, though painful, were necessary, and some lies, though safe, were rot in the bones. He stared at the moon. It offered no answer. When he returned to the king, he did not bow. "I've decided," he said. "I will speak, but I will speak truth." The court grew still. King Alon's smile faded just slightly. "A pity," he said. "You could have had the world." Daphnos turned and left. Gold weighed less than guilt. He still had one lie left, but now he knew that the weight of it was not in its use. It was in the choosing. Daphnos returned home with empty hands, but a mind heavy with meaning. The lie he had refused to tell still clung to him like smoke. It had not been spoken, yet its shape lingered in the air. The king had offered him a shortcut through life, a lie carved neatly into the shape of a ladder, but Daphnos had chosen not to climb. Weeks passed, seasons shifted, fields greened and browned again. Daphnos resumed the rhythm of a farmer's son, hauling water, shearing goats, listening to crickets. But the villagers whispered. They heard of his audience with King Alcon. Some called him foolish for rejecting the offer. Others said he must have lied and simply hid the riches. Rumours fed on silence. Even his father grew cold, thinking Daphnos had failed to seize a chance to lift them all from poverty. Still Daphnos said nothing. Not a truth, not a lie, just breath and work. And yet the gift remained. One lie left. At night, he would lie awake wondering what to do with it. Could he use it to ease someone's grief? To shield a friend from pain? To trick a cruel man into mercy? The more he thought, the heavier it became. A single unspent lie dangling like a golden thread he dared not pull. Then came the day a neighbour's child went missing in the woods. Panic rippled through the village. Daphnos joined the Fessing's search, scouring brambles, calling into hollow trees. He found the child just before dusk, caught in a snare of roots and too afraid to cry out. He carried her home. silent as the stars rising above. That night, someone asked, "Did you find her with the help of your god gift?" He could have said yes. He could have claimed divinity, mystery, fate. But he simply said, "No, just footprints and patience." The villagers did not cheer, but they nodded. For once they looked at him without judgment. That night, Hermes appeared again. No theatrics this time, just a man beside the hearth, warming his hands. "You never used the last one," he said. Daphnos shrugged. "Maybe that's the lie that I need it at all." Hermes laughed softly, like wind through dry reeds, and vanished. Word of Daphnos spread farther than he expected. Bards began to mention the tale of a farmer's son who fed a god and earned the power to lie without consequence. Merchants repeated the story in taverns, reshaping it with every telling, until Daphnos had become a silver-tongued rogue, a prophet, a trickster, even a demigod. None of it true, none of it denied. Curious travellers came, some to seek wisdom, others to test him. One nobleman asked him to bless his crops. A merchant begged him to curse a rival's ships. A priest, solemn, asked him what the gods had whispered into his ear. To each, Daphnos gave the same response. "I'm no priest, no hero, no oracle, just a boy who once shared his bread." Yet it didn't matter. Silence, too, could be shaped into legend. One evening, a blind woman arrived at his doorstep. She had walked miles, led by her grandson, to ask a single question. "Is my son alive?" Daphnos hesitated. He knew nothing of her son, had never heard his brain's name, but her face held hope, not for truth, but for peace. And there it was, the final lie, unused, but ever hovering. He could tell her yes. She would smile, maybe sleep better for a time. It would cost nothing. Hermes's promise still lingered. One lie with no punishment. But Daphnos paused and told her the truth. "I don't know." Her smile did not fade. She touched his hand, gently. "Then I'll hope until hope ends." When she left, Daphnos stared into the darkness and wondered, had he done the right thing, or had he simply feared the weight of even a harmless deception? That night, the stars seemed dimmer. Even the moon, usually comforting, turned away behind clouds. Truth, he realized, was not a torch. It was a labyrinth, a path with no map, only choices. And somewhere in the woods, Hermes laughed softly to himself. Not mockery, but pride. Not in the lies unspoken, but in the questions that remained. By midsummer, Daphnos's name had travelled to marble halls and golden thrones. Eventually, it reached the ears of King Phren, a ruler famed not for wisdom, but for vanity. He fancied himself just, but held court more as theatre than law. Riddles amused him. Secrets aroused him. Lies. He considered them an art form. So, when he heard there was a boy in Arcadia who could lie without consequence, he summoned Daphnos with much fanfare and a fine litter of silk. The boy arrived barefoot, unimpressed by the palace's pillars or feasts. The king greeted him with wine and an offer wrapped in velvet words. "I hear you speak falsehoods like a poet," said Phaeorian, swirling his cup. "Would you do so for coin?" Daphnos hesitated. "What lie, your majesty?" The king grinned. "I wish you to testify in court that my rival, Lord Demdes, plotted to poison me. He has not, of course. But I'd prefer the world think otherwise." Daphnos stared at the floor. "You ask me to stain an innocent man?" Phaeorian chuckled. "Only for a while, a season perhaps, long enough to discredit to him. Then we'll clear his name eventually. You'll be paid, elevated. Your village will never hunger again." It was temptation dressed as justice, power wrapped in poetry. Daphnos asked for a night to think. In the guest chamber, he sat with the weight of the third lie. A boy with no shoes was being asked to destroy a man he'd never met, for wealth he never sought, by a king who had never known hunger. The lie would be easy. He would feel nothing. He would suffer nothing, but someone else would. By dawn, he returned to the throne room where the king waited with a jeweled ring meant for a liar. Daphnos bowed. "Lo, I'm afraid," he said softly, "that I already used my last lie on a child who believed the stars could sing. It was not true, but neither was it false." Phaeorian scowled. "A shame. You might have been a great man," Daphno smiled. "Perhaps, but not a small one." And so he left the palace, richer in spirit, poorer in friends, and no longer certain what price he'd truly paid. Word of Daphnos's refusal spread quietly, like embers beneath leaves. The villagers whispered about the boy who turned down a king. Some called him brave, others foolish, but none could ignore the subtle shift in how they looked at him. The baker gave him 2 loaves instead of 1. The priest nodded, with something that resembled respect. Even the magistrate, once dismissive, invited him to speak at local gatherings, just to hear what kind of wisdom came from a mouth that could lie, without fear, and chose not to. But Daphnos did not feel wise. He felt burdened. The knowledge of what he could have done clung to him like smoke. He could have accepted the king's favour, reshaped his fate, lifted his village. One lie, that's all it would have taken, and yet he'd walked away. Some nights as he lay on the straw mat in his father's cottage, he wondered if he had failed his family more than he had honoured himself. The gods, it seemed, were silent. Hermes had not returned. No wink, no smirk, no clever riddles or blessings. One twilight, as Daphnos sat by the riverbank, he watched a beetle crawl across a stone. Tiny, persistent, meaningless. And he realized the beetle did not care for gods or kings. It lived its truth without reward. Perhaps, he thought, that was all life asked of a person too. Just then, a breeze stirred the reeds. A glint of silver shimmered briefly at the river's edge. A coin, polished, ancient, etched with wings. No note, no explanation, just the token. A silent nod from a god who thrived on chaos, and yet understood restraint. Daphnos pocketed it and smiled, not because he was richer, but because he finally understood the value of the path he'd chosen. Truth, he realized, was not something one shouted from rooftops or carved into stone. It was a quiet thing, a seed buried in the soil, waiting, growing, and sometimes even the gods watched to see what it would become. Months passed. Daphnos returned to the rhythms of village life, mending fences, tending goats, sharing stories beneath olive trees. His 3 divine lies, now fully spent, had left no scar and no glory, only silence. Then came the day when dust stirred on the road, and silver-plated hooves clattered toward the village. The king's procession, bright with banners and sharp with spears, stopped just beyond, to the well. This time, the king did not arrive cloaked in veiled promises. He came down from his chariot and faced Daphnos directly. "You could have had wealth," the king said. "Instead, you chose dust and goats. I must understand why." The villagers gathered, hushed. Daphnos looked the king in the eye. "I chose not to lie," he said simply. The king frowned. "But truth brings no feast, no crown, no legacy. It brings peace," Daphnos answered, "and a clean sleep." The king studied him, then turned his gaze to the crowd. "This boy," he said, "refused power for principle. If he is a fool, he is a noble one." To everyone's astonishment, the king presented Daphnos with a gift. Not gold, but a scroll, a charter. It granted his family's land tax-free, status for a generation. "You've earned more than riches," the king said. "You've earned respect. And perhaps, unwittingly, you've reminded me what kings are meant to be." He left as swiftly as he came. That evening, Daphnos did not celebrate with wine or boasts. He sat under the stars and quietly thanked the gods, even Hermes, for the strange road he'd walked. He had nothing to show for it, and yet everything. Truth, it seemed, might not be loud, but it echoed. Autumn arrived, brushing the village fields with gold. The memory of the king's visit had faded into local legend, and Daphnos had returned to obscurity with a quiet satisfaction. But Hermes, ever a god of lingering interest, was not done with him yet. One night, as the moon cast thin silver through the olive branches, Daphnos heard laughter. Not human, not bird, but something in between. By the goat pen stood a stranger, cloaked in smoke, eyes glinting like forged bronze. "Hermes, you've done well," the god said. Not in praise, but in amusement, no great havoc, no grand scandal, just little truths stitched with care. Most mortals would have wasted my gift on vanity or vengeance. Daphnos remained silent. He had no illusions about earning a god's approval. Hermes stepped closer, his craned fingers weaving light through the air like thread. "So I grant you a final lie," he said. "Not to speak, but to live." Daphnos frowned. "What does that mean?" The god only smiled. "There's no fun in explaining riddles. Just walk it. And remember, every truth becomes a lie when believed hard enough." The next morning, Daphnos woke to find the village changed. People who once scoffed now greeted him with respect. Strangers arrived at his door asking for advice. Some whispered that he was touched by prophecy, others that he'd spoken with gods. He never corrected them. That was the final lie. He let them believe. Let their myth of him grow until it no longer needed his voice. He became a symbol not of heroism or defiance, but of quiet cunning, of the power not to declare lies, but to leave them unsaid. Even Hermes, from time to time, passed through the village, disguised as a wandering merchant or lazy crow, chuckling to himself at the game that never quite ended. And Daphnos, farmer's son, lived his life not in glory, but in story, a walking paradox, a living myth, the boy who gave a god a crust of bread, and in return, learned that sometimes the most powerful lies are the ones you let others tell for you. Years passed. Daphnos grew old, though not overly rich nor powerful. He never built temples in his name. No, bronze statues stood in the aurora. But his name lived in a different way, whispered among travelling merchants, etched into riddles told by firelight and sewn into the dreams of children whose fathers lied for a living. He had never used his gift for cruelty, but he had used it. That mattered. When the time came and his breath grew shallow, like low tide before a storm, Hermes returned, not in disguise, not as shadow or smoke, but as himself, winged, radiant, and very tired-looking. "You lied well," Hermes said, crouching beside the bed of straw and thyme. Daphnos, now a man of few words, merely smiled. "I only said what others needed to hear." "That," the god replied, "is the most dangerous kind." Hermes reached into his robes and pulled out a feather, his own, ivory, long, impossibly light. "Take this," he said, "and walk the last road, with no burden. You'll find no judges at the gate, just a mirror, and whatever you say to it will be the truth." Daphnos held the feather. Not gold, not silver, just a fragment of myth, a reminder that every lie had cost, even the kind ones. When he closed his eyes for the last time, the villagers said the wind came, down from the mountains, and lingered by the fields longer than usual. The olive trees leaned as if listening. The crows cawed not in mourning, but in laughter. And somewhere far beyond any map, Hermes tucked the farmer's son's name into a riddle. Not a warning, not a legend, but a question. When is a lie kindness? And when is kindness just cowardice in disguise? The answer, of course, still depends on who's listening and who's speaking and whether the gods are watching. Because sometimes even the truth wears wings.